Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and welcome to my channel. I'm really stoked because I have been very creatively fulfilled with my most recent creative project, which is creative nonfiction. It was actually inspired by this book that I found while browsing at DI called Writing Creative Nonfiction. And the book is by Theodore Cheney. And this book was actually a lot of help when preparing to write my creative nonfiction called Rough House, which is about my experiences with mental health struggles, my experiences with helping people struggling with addiction, my experiences at work, where I work at a rehab center, as well as philosophical threads about recovery and narrative and literature. And I'm super excited that I've been able to write this book. I will be completing it very soon. It's just a matter of time. And I'm very excited that I've been able to write this book. And I thought that for my Writer's Writer series, my Writer's Writer series, that I would kind of explore some of the things I learned while thinking about the principles in creative nonfiction writing, as well as thinking about my experiences in life and literature, thinking about my experiences as a writer. And so, without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, in my experiences as a writer, I have thought a lot about poetry and fiction, and even nonfiction in terms of essays. But creative nonfiction was kind of something I've been interested in for a while that I haven't necessarily explored until reading this book and until recently. And I think that there are a lot of things that are worth investigating when it comes to thinking about how to write creative nonfiction. Now, there are two modes that you could describe, the objective mode and the subjective mode. So when you look at New Journalism, which was a movement with writers and thinkers and creators such as Joanne Didion, for example, you get this idea where even though you're writing nonfiction, you're looking at it from your own point of view. So you might still have a lot of facts on the ground, and you might still have a lot of data and information, but there's also that kind of emotional tint or that narrative tint of autobiography where it's very personal. And the subjective point of view is actually often challenging traditional journalism, which is more the objective mode, which focuses a lot on facts on the ground, like I was saying, like focusing on when you think of journalism, you think of writers who are reporting on the ground, who are reporting only facts. And the reason why I wanted to bring up this distinction of the objective mode versus the subjective mode is because I really thought about this claim to authority, of authorial point of view. Are writers sources of information and truth, or is there much more to it, as is described in the postmodern vein of the muddiness of language, as well as the lack of authority in narrative that writers have, or don't have, you could say. And so I think in this book, I did want to challenge my own thinking about the objective versus the subjective mode. And so I would say, in a very general sense, I am very much like Soren Kierkegaard, where my approach is very autobiographical and subjective, where I might have different personas, sometimes in my writing, and different ideas and themes that I want to explore, but I definitely want to engage it from my own perspective, because I have this inner light that I want to express, as Carl Jung might imagine, for people to be tuned in to their introspection and self-reflection, to be tuned into their subjective world. And I think Joanne Didion is a good example of such an approach. But to me, it's interesting because I also am very much fascinated by the facts on the ground, especially when it comes to recovery, such as with mental health recovery or recovery from substances and from substance abuse. And so what I would say is really interesting about this contrast is that I was able to take an interesting way of looking at the facts on the ground with my own experience with work. And so there might be more philosophical, kind of rational or rationalistic approaches to my writing, but I also intersperse that with my, for lack of a better word, memoir or autobiographical writing, where, while I do change the details for ethical reasons, I do focus a lot on my actual experiences and what I've learned in this process. Now, the reason why all of this is important, not just for people interested in learning about the art of writing, especially thinking about creative nonfiction and nonfiction in general, I also think it's important for thinking about how we orient ourselves towards life. And so one thing that Cheney talks about in his book is this idea of structure. And so structure is a very important concept when thinking about how you are going to write your book. My biggest way of thinking about structure in kind of a broad literary sense is thinking about narrative and how narrative structures our stories and it structures our words and it structures our whole worldviews. And so narrative is not the only thing to isolate and the only thing to look at, but I do think it is an important one. And the reason why I think it's important here is because I liked the idea of alternating between different threads in my book Rough House. Because while I do have a continuing narrative arc where I'm thinking about my experiences at work and I'm actually reflecting on what I've learned and experienced in real time, I also intersperse that with other narrative threads. So thinking about my experiences in mental hospitals, thinking about my experiences with mental health struggles and mental health in general, thinking about people in my life who have struggled with addiction. And I intersperse that with philosophical and even a little bit more scientific rationalist approaches to writing, to where I'm looking at things in terms of what I've learned with studying the neuroscience of addiction and studying the neuroscience of the brain in general and the things that I learned. And I want to kind of highlight why this is important as a writer, is because even though these principles may be tried and true but can also be challenged, these principles are here, and those are things that are easy to convey, I think, relatively so, because it's not necessarily the practice of writing, you're more just describing the writing. So instead of actually writing a book, you're more just thinking about how to write a book. But the reason why I want to bring that up here is because for me, I'm very glad that in Rough House I'm like attached to it, I'm like entangled in it, and I'm entangled in it because I'm looking at it in terms of a writer who wants to write. So a writer's perspective, not just an individual who experiences things and then thinking about them, because even though that is of course valuable, there is a different practice whenever you're thinking about writing specifically. And so writing is very broad. Writing can even sometimes be very vague, or it can go into unexpected territory, which is kind of the excitement behind creative nonfiction. But if there's anything that I want to convey here as a writer to another writer, because even though there are the bigger points about how we look at the world and how we structure our worldviews and how we structure our experiences, there's a way in which the thing that I learned the most from writing this book and from reading books on creative nonfiction and thinking about writing, I think it's very simple. I think it can be articulated simply, which is embedding yourself in the writing that you're doing. And so even if it is very important to capture the more technical elements of writing, you want to throw yourself into it. So maybe I take a more Kierkegaardian mode to my creative nonfiction, which is very possible. But I think it's important because the contrast to your writing and to throwing yourself into your writing is that you have these other tools at your disposal. You have this ability to think about technical skill when writing stories and when thinking about things. And this contrasts very nicely with me and with my project Rough House because of the way in which it helped me realize how much is going on in my mind when I'm thinking about writing and when I'm actually writing, and how I love being able to structure it in a very solid way while also thinking about it in terms of my own narrative and my own point of view. So you could say that the narrative in Rough House is the narrative of maybe an outside observer looking in when there's the more rationalist, objective, scientific, philosophical parts. But then there's the part of it to where it's just me. And creative nonfiction can utilize a lot of different tools. Like we're saying here, it is very easy for you to tap into the objective mode. You can tap into the objective mode and look at it in terms of objectivity, and you could be like a traditional journalist. But I like the idea of realizing that I can never separate myself from my own narratives. And in fact, I can never separate myself from objective narratives or narrative as kind of a broader concept and what narrative means with books, with writing, with thinking, with composing across different genres and different disciplines. And it does get very complicated. But I think it is a very fascinating thing to explore. And so, of course, this is up for debate. We could take a more rationalist approach and really argue whether or not we should throw ourselves into our stories, especially when we're writing about facts and we're writing about events. You know, even like you wouldn't expect a historian to throw themselves into a history of the world or a history of a civilization. But that's kind of what I'm doing with this writing. And so I wanted to just present that as an idea because, again, we could argue it, but it's more just to think about it and think about how you want to write your own stories. Because, again, I do look at this from writer to writer. I see this, my thoughts and advice on writing, to you as also a writer. And so I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is another element here, which is what I learned in basic creative writing courses, but which I've also read about and thought about, which is that you want to be able to think about your writing in terms of scenes, because you want concrete details. So you can have the kind of explanatory approach, and there is a place for that. That's what philosophical discourse is. You're constantly looking at it in terms of that element of literally the exposition or the explaining or the writing about things. But then you can also take it in terms of scenes, in terms of the concrete details, in terms of experiences. And this does make sense because according to cognitive psychology, we definitely gravitate and remember the things that have an emotional appeal to us, that evoke some kind of emotion. And I'll be honest, this has been difficult to work on throughout this book, but I think that it is important, and I think there is value in trying to do that because of what you can learn when exploring it, and of what you can learn whenever you're thinking about it. And so I think it's very important to try to bring in concrete details, even while I know for myself, I throw myself into my writing, and sometimes I do show, and then other times I do actually tell, because it's that contrast between showing versus telling. And so yeah, I've definitely learned a lot, and I'm definitely excited to continue to learn more. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. I hope that you'll check out my other videos. I hope that you'll check out my books, and I'm very excited that I've been able to write this book. I'm very excited that I've had a chance. So thank you for watching this episode in my Writer's Writer series, and I will see you soon.